Hey, folks, welcome back to the Land Fixer podcast. I'm your host, Logan Swanson, and today we're talking all about dirt and roads with Tommy Safford. Say hi, Tommy.
Good morning, guys.
Awesome. Glad to have you. Folks, our episode today is brought to you by Roads. Roads take you places, they come in all shapes and sizes. We love roads. If you are interested in getting some deals funded, go to landpartnerfunding.com. Check that out. If you want to talk to me, email me at thelandfixer@gmail.com. I'm happy to partner with you on deals, subdivide projects. If you're a landowner and you want to do something creative or fun with the land you already own, I'd be happy to work with you as well. So, Tommy, thank you for joining us today. This is actually a long awaited and very requested episode of the podcast where we're going to talk about roads and soil and all of the things that a lot of land investors don't think about when they're buying a property, or they only think very little about when they're considering subdividing a property, which would include improvements such as a road. So, before we get into that, can you just kind of tell folks a little bit about yourself, what you do, and then I'll start barraging you with these questions.
Yeah. So we own a dirt company, or I have a skid steer. We've done, well, let's start. I actually have built houses most of my career or welded. Welding's a big thing. Found love for messing around in the skid steers and heavy equipment when I joined up with a couple of builders and was trying to learn how to do, from looking at a bunch of trees to making a subdivision and having houses. I fell in love with getting in that equipment and feeling the vibration, pushing things around and making things just look uniform and attractive. Though there's another side of me. I'm an avid hunter, and then I'm out in the wilderness knocking trees down and chasing deer out. But yeah, let me think about when I started pushing on dirt in the early, I would say 2006, 2007. So I've been doing it for a while. Been steady for the last several years of just really learning about the different types of materials you use to start anything, because houses or commercial buildings, they a lot of times, like here in North Texas, we have this horrible black dirt that just moves all the time, so you can't put anything on top of it, and it's not a good thing to have a road on top of either, as then the water just keeps coming.
Mhm.
So like I said, I fell in love with it when I started to see, at your Tennessee project. You had all these trees, and then now there's this beautiful road. People can get out there and have access to things that you normally wouldn't. You'd have to walk for miles to get somewhere instead of driving. So what else? I don't know, Logan. That's where I'm at with the roads, because that's what
Yeah,
we're talking
so
about today.
perfect. That's a great intro. So, you are a builder and a dirt mover, dirt pusher. I like that. That would, if I was you, that would be my business card. Tommy Safford, dirt pusher. Yeah. What, you've done some projects for me, and what we've always talked about. Like I sat you down one time. I remember when we were working on my project out in Ridgeway, and we went
Yeah.
and got lunch in Sulphur Springs, and I was like, all right, tell me the best way to build a road economically, and we sat and hemmed and hawed, and you're telling me all about it. And I was able to sort of ply you with a few questions that were really informative for me. So I'm just going to do that whole process again so that some folks
Okay.
can have that same experience, because it's very valuable for me. So, what a lot of people are going to do when they're looking at maybe their first subdivision, they're going to try to put in their first road, is they're going to just look at the GIS imagery of that property, and they're going to look at subdividing it into just straight rectangles as easily as possible and just run the road in a straight line down the middle. Is that, in your experience, usually the best practice, or is it best to go out there and look at the terrain first?
I would go and look at the terrain, because my main thing, and it's always been, especially if you're dealing with, let's say, if you're within some city limits. I don't see us building a whole lot of roads within city limits, but there's subdivisions down the road from me where they had a figure of water. Water is your biggest issue anywhere, especially if you're subdividing for residential homes. well, and commercial too, but let's look at the residential thing because I think that's what land flippers, when they do subdivisions, are selling to maybe builders residentially for residential work. Water is a beast, and you gotta get rid of it. Things got to stay dry. The houses got to stay dry. Properties need to stay dry. The worst thing that can happen is you're looking at that GIS and you think, oh, I'm going to put this road straight here, but then that road is actually higher than all of your properties. So what's going to happen when it rains? A, you know, maybe the builder's going to figure out how to divert the water off of the property as is, but imagine just everything flowing into the property from the center. It just, and you have these, then you try and make ditches and you're way down in the dirt. That's not economical. That's too much work, too much spoils trying, you need to get rid of. Sometimes the material that you would be cutting out of the V ditches on a road that's higher than everything else can't go on the properties because it's this dirt is just not sound for building.
Mm-hmm.
So I always try to look, when I've been involved in that and not told where to put the roads, I've always tried to say, let's find the lowest point. Because if you just take a second when you're driving home, a good situation, or actually, I believe everywhere you drive and where there's houses, the road is always lower than the houses. You can walk outside right now and there is a slight slope on your front yard. They use the roads to move the water away from the houses because the houses are the things that are valuable, right?
Yeah.
So when if you just call somebody and you're like, hey, I'm going to put this straight road right here, and the guy doesn't know, maybe he just knows how to use the equipment. He doesn't understand different types of soil and road base and et cetera. Gets out there, he cuts this road for you, you pay him, and everything starts flooding. But you ask the owner before you bought, or after it starts flooding, you call the old owner and you're like, hey, why are my properties retaining water? You told me, you didn't have that kind of issue, and it's because the road is now became a containment for the lots where water has nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And I've seen this a couple of times down towards Lake Livingston. I've seen a road put in and the lots never filled with water before, but now they're filling up with water. So looking at it from the top down, great. Get an idea of how long your road's going to be, because it's going to still be the same amount of material unless we got to turn somewhere. But I would always find the lowest point and cut the road and use the road in the ditches to get the water out of your subdivision as best you
Yeah.
can, especially in a country or rural area.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me early on when I was getting into land investing, I think it was my first or second year, I was attempting to work with a guy in Ellis County that does residential subdivisions, like kind of bigger ones, 100 homes, 150 homes. And he had me just trying to bird dog some land for him. Like, hey, go find me land. If you find a good deal on land, I'll kind of hold your hand and you can watch me do the subdivision. That started that kind of relationship. And I was like, hell yeah, I want to get that insider view and maybe a little profit out of it.
Yes.
And I went ahead and found a bunch of people that had land, and I started having those conversations with them. And we actually went out and we drove to visit a few different properties. And what I thought was really interesting is they asked the same three questions on every property we visited. The first one was, where's the water running? Right. So you're looking at the general topography. And even if it's a slight grade, there's always a grade. And
Yeah.
you kind of actually want a grade. You really don't want something too flat, because when it's too flat, water doesn't run anywhere. And on our soil, that's going to pool. So you want a grade. You don't want it to be too dynamic of a grade. And you want that grade directed in such a way that the water is going to run off in a controllable fashion, or to a place where you can retain it or drain it. So I thought that was interesting. Like, I'd never really thought about that. It's like, okay, which way does the water run was the first question. The second question is, which way does the shit go? That was what they'd always say. So is there sewer? Where's the sewer? How big is the sewer line? Can we tap into it? Do we have to put a lift in there? I think they call it a lift.
Yeah. Right.
And then third, where's the water line, right? So that was always the three questions. But I thought it was fascinating. I was always used to thinking the two most important questions were the water line and the sewer line. But the first question for them was always, which way does the water run? Because it affects literally everything. And this is something that a lot of people don't really think about when they're building their, I'll just say from my experience, I didn't think about when I was, organizing and building my first road. I was like, okay, I looked at the map. That's the straight line. I already drew where the lots are supposed to be. So just put the road there. And the guy I worked with put the road there, but there was a lot of time and energy that went into just moving the dirt around, right? So that's something that you and I talk about. Maybe you can go into this. So I'll have you talk more on this is like anytime you move dirt, it has to go somewhere,
Yeah,
right?
that's what I was saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And big machines aren't very fast, right? So
Mhm. Mhm.
it can be a lot of time, a lot of diesel, and a lot of hours on rented equipment to just move dirt if you're not being efficient. Or it could be extra machines, right? So, like, what's the process if you have to move spoils from, say, one side of a 50-acre property to another? Is that a quick process, slow process?
No, and how far? 50, yeah,
Say 50 acres.
oh, you would, if you wanted to move it efficiently or time manually, you're going to need to use trucks. And how are the trucks going to get over there? Because even big loaders can only hold so many yards at a time, you know? And some of this equipment is so expensive, and you're not going, most likely, in my experience, the guys that have that size equipment don't really have time for small projects.
Mm-hmm.
50 acres is probably a small project for them,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you would have to have your contractor rent something. I'm not trying to think of what size loader, but it probably doesn't matter that much right now in this hypothetical. But they can't move as you can load a truck 18 yards, 20 yards of some material, and they can move it faster than a front loader could or something like that. But especially a dozer, because a dozer, all it does is just move the dirt.
Mm-hmm.
So you could end up in a situation where you have three pieces of equipment out there. Say you have a big or a nice size D6, and you have to push what we call I don't know why it's coming to me, but you got to push the dirt off, and then you have an excavator out there that's loading a dump truck, and then a dump truck getting rid of it. You're and moving it off onto the property. So that's an issue that sometimes when you're looking at a property to buy it, you don't factor that in, and that could be a serious situation with you and your investors or you and your money,
Yeah. And
where
let's
the
linger on
contract.
this for a second, right? So if you're smart, right, you lay out your road maybe in the natural low points of the property. Theoretically, you can build roads with a small dozer and a skid steer if you're not pushing a bunch of soil or moving it. But if you do have a bunch of soil that's excess and needs to be moved elsewhere, which we call spoils,
Yeah,
you can put yourself in a situation where you need your skid and your dozer on the road that you're building. You need an
correct.
excavator to
Hmm.
shovel all that stuff up and drop it in trucks. Big trucks, which oftentimes have tires, not tracks. So now you're limited because they can't run in wet weather. So you kind of need a road for them to move from one to the
That's what I was
other.
about to say. You might have to cut a road for them to move it.
Yeah.
Uh,
And then you get to the other side and you're not going to build a mound. You're probably going to have another machine over there leveling. So you could be in a situation where you go from having just a dozer and a skid to two dozers, a skid, an excavator, and one or two trucks moving material. And you have to build a separate road for that. So,
correct.
like, this is so important that it really can't be overstated how much cost you can add to a project by just poorly planning.
Well, you
Yeah.
would start with I want to do that was the negative side. Let's do a positive look at something. So maybe we don't scare people off of certain deals or something, right? Where they got $100,000 ticket they didn't expect. If you soil test, especially on subdivisions, I recommend soil testing, especially where you're plotted, where you and your contractor, if he's worth a grain of salt, should know he should be able to go out there and even shoot grade. He should have proper tools to do all of that for you. We're kind of getting into the other part of contractors, but
Mm-hmm.
if you do a soil test and they come back and they tell you that you have that famous black dirt that North Texas does, or a lot of rock, when you get closer to Oklahoma. Let's just use our area since I'm familiar with it. You might just pick the lowest points you can that make sense and truck soil in instead
Mm-hmm.
of trying to remove this soil. You know, I've done that where we bring in what we call select fill, which has a lot of, it's got sand, clay, and plastics in it. And the plastics is what gets rid of the water off, pushes, leaves the water up. Anyways, and it packs hard as concrete. And a lot of people use that for rural roads and then just go back with a road base like crushed limestone or something like that. But anyways, on the upside of things, if you really get down in there, it's going to cost a little money, but I would test the soils to know if I'm going to have to cut this out and move it to the corner of my property. And if I move it to the corner of the subdivision, am I going to lose a lot? You know?
Mm-hmm.
So I've always tried to, every situation's unique. There is no actual, oh yeah, that's how it's going to be. Right. There's you probably have run that in a few other roads and subdivisions you've built in or you're building now. It's like too sandy.
Mm-hmm.
So do we build on top of it or do we get rid of it?
Yep.
And then if we're going to build the road higher than the lots, how are we going to, there's some things that'll cost you a lot of money that surprises, but I have found that the things I'm involved, I'm like, whoa, wait, guys, let's move the road going this way. I know it's going to mess up your square lots, but would you rather be in maybe a a court problem because you sold this that was discussed, and then all of a sudden there's water or the road is eroding or side, you know,
Mm-hmm.
uh, we've and then there's practices on the road. We've run into that on some of your other stuff,
Mm-hmm.
where I fixed a couple of things for you.
Yep. And we're going to get into that. So before we do,
I get ahead
a
of it.
few things that I want to talk about. So one, right now we're kind of discussing like redneck road building, right? It's literally
Yeah.
like if we're out in
Yes.
the county does not care. They're like, just put in what you want as long as you tell people the county's not going to take care of it. Oftentimes they're going to require like an HOA or something to do or be responsible for the road maintenance. And then you just don't really have any guidelines. Like you can go do whatever you want. But if you're going to be even half professional, even in redneck road building, it is oftentimes worth it to do a topographical survey. It's going to seem crazy expensive, like a topographical survey of even just the roadway area or something like that. I mean, it could run you 20 grand, 25, 30 grand. I mean, easy. And that's on the low end. If you have a big property, it can go much higher than that.
Can't.
So it might seem unreal. And then road engineering, right? So you can go to a professional, a civil engineer, and say, hey, I want to cut a road into this property. Here's my topographical map. Can you tell me where I ought to put it and what I'll encounter? And that engineer is going to look at the topography. It's going to see the high and the low point, like you're discussing, and say, hey, maybe let's put it here. But on top of that, we're going to probably want to put ditches in a certain way. And I'll have you talk about ditches here shortly. And then also maybe water retention areas. So the water's going to run off. Maybe there's not a natural place where it's completely escaped the boundary of the property or run to a county road where they already have this whole system engineered. So maybe we actually need to install a depression where all the water can run to. And realistically, it'll hold enough water that it'll account for a severe rainfall and not wash away the road or flood homes in the neighborhood or whatever. But the reason that engineering can be so powerful is because it then gives you the opportunity to hand that road plan to multiple contractors and say, hey, tell me what you would charge to build this road. And it's not like 5 different guys are going to go out and scratch their heads and say, well, I'd put the road here, or I'd put the road here, or I'd put 6 inches of road base or 10 inches of road base, because then you never actually get comparable estimates because they're bidding on different roads of different quality, of different layout, of different, and it's going to be an almost impossible situation to navigate, and one in which you are very likely to run into an expensive change order at some point or somebody underbidding the project. So the topographical survey, the engineering, which can be done affordably, the engineering can be done very affordably if you're willing to go outside of the country. And then thirdly, what you said is the soil testing. If you know what materials you have on site that are usable for the road versus what needs to be trucked in versus what needs to be potentially trucked out or moved elsewhere on the property, all of those things come together to provide the necessary outline for road with any longevity. If you're not doing all of those things, you can put a lot of money into a road that exists for 2 years, 5 years, and is just
Yeah,
gone.
doesn't hold up to anything. You come back and you don't even know where the road's at.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's true. I've been involved in some of that. Yeah.
Yep. So cool.
Those two
So,
things, man.
and on top of that, I guess we'll get into, I want to ask you about contractors, and we're already going through the time so fast. The the idea that somebody like, okay, so people are bringing me subdivision projects all the time, and they're like, "Hey, I called a few road guys, and they said the road would be $100,000." And I'll ask them, "Did they visit the property?" They're like, "No, they just looked at the map." Is it even like hypothetically possible to give an estimate for a road?
No, I've when I deal with other road guys myself, maybe subs sometimes, and also some of the guys I hang out with in the industry. Years ago, everybody went. Everybody went, did what I was talking about earlier. We'd even shoot grades and we'd look at things ourselves. There wasn't a whole lot of, I mean, on like a very valuable subdivision that needs a concrete or asphalt road, there was engineers involved and stuff like that. But I'm talking about rural areas, the county, like you were saying. We used to go. I still do. You know that. You give me something and I'll drive 2.5 hours to look at it if it's a project that makes sense money wise for my business. But now I hear people like, I forget her name. She called me the other day and she had already gotten a quote from a contractor that didn't go out there and it was $100,000. And I went out there and I was like, no, at worst case scenario, we're at in the 40s and $50,000, worst case, because I went, I saw what we could do. There was people there, so I didn't mess around too much, but just with my eye from being professional in my trade, I knew we were going to have to move stuff around. These guys, a friend of mine, he just uses Google Maps and he's like, Tom, I'm going to do this road for this much. And I said, no, you're not. Then he calls me, hey, can you come bail me out? I'm out of money. I can't, and there was so much that I didn't see. And well, why didn't you go? And then now you've signed contracts with people and they expect you to deliver a product to them. And you have to go back to them and say, I signed this, I gave you this bid, you accepted it. And they probably accepted it because it was the lowest one,
Yeah.
because he didn't go out and look or she didn't go out and look, whoever. It's a big thing. You need to. Now, you 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 want to make sure before you do that this is a real thing. You can be wasting a lot of time going to several properties way out of your area, and you know so yes, you should, and you're going to tell them something before you even go out there to see how they react.
Mm-hmm.
you know I know guys that like have a linear foot or per quarter mile or whatever the situation is, and then they make adjustments when they get out to the property. But a lot of guys will give this bid and say, that's what I'm going to do it for. And then you're going to jump on it. If it works in your budget, you're going to be like, yeah, let's do it. Let's get this contract signed. Let's go out there and let's start
Yeah, and
making roads.
let's so before we get into working with contractors, because I do want to get in depth on this, let's talk just a little bit about ditches and culverts and just some of the basics around moving water and why it's important. So when I was first building a road, because I had no construction or road experience, I was like, just put the road there. What are you talking about?
Sounds like you got
Um,
more than me now.
yeah. So, and you've actually fixed. So one of my projects, I took the lowest bid, or yeah, it was the lowest bid. And when they put the road in, they brought an excavator out and they scooped the ditches. And they had just like shoot, shoot. They scooped the ditches all the way down, and they gave me this like
You
U-shaped
shape.
valley all the way down, and it started overgrowing. And I said, "Hey, Tommy, can you go out there and run a what a bush hog or something out there
But
and clean that up for me?" And you're like, "No, I can't do that. Why can't you do that?"
well, you couldn't get to the equipment. would get stuck because of the way the ditch was dug. And so I was like, yeah, when I went out there, I was like, there's no way you would literally have to do this whole road with a weed eater,
Yeah.
with a weed eater, because even a tractor with the brush hogging on the rear of it's still going to sit a certain way. Rock had spilled over because of erosion, and so your blades are just going to be hitting these big 1.5 minus crushed concrete and slinging it, messing your equipment up. Now you said we know they used an excavator and they just scooped it out, but you can use an excavator to make V ditches because a ditch needs to be like a V. That's my experience, and a steady slope into it, not a drastic one, especially if they need to be maintained. If your expense gets up there when the guy's like, okay, I have a, let's say, half mile of road ditches to clean up, and he has to weed eat it, that would drive me. Like I told, well, example, I said, no, I'm not doing
Yeah,
that.
no, it won't. Right.
I'm gonna get the tractor stuck, or I have a Bobcat skid steer, so I put the brush hog attachment on the front, and I'll do the ditches that way. And there was no way to do that. My tractor would have been my skid steer definitely would have got stuck. And even though I have that thick forestry glass on the front of the opening, I bet you them crushed concrete would have been it'd have been a disaster.
So what did we have to do out there?
We ended up, I took my skid steer, which this situation we could have used the little dozer also, and I just got in the ditch and started pulling dirt out to create a V, because what we actually had, if you can see me on camera, was this, you know. And then there was areas where it was starting to cliff, like the cul-de-sac. I'm
Yep.
using the cul-de-sac. It was almost straight up and down. So you imagine, let's say somebody builds a house in there, mom in a minivan, and she's going to turn around in that cul-de-sac, and that thing just gives way. Who's getting in trouble, And what happened there was, I don't think that they actually got any kind of equipment or tools out there to find your grade, find where the water's moving, see the natural topography of where the water has been going for 100 years, and say, this is how we're going to build the road. And then we need they should have used the dozer. If they had one out there, they should have just used the dozer and just cut your V ditch. And we can go into how to do that, but that would take a long time.
Yeah,
But
well
that's the
this
proper equipment, you
yeah, so
know.
that's a good point. So if from the design perspective, if you're a land investor and you're determining where you want the road, one of the things that you're going to run into is how wide the easement is. So part of this was we didn't have a wide easement because I was only thinking in terms of like roads and how big does a ditch need to be. I was like, okay, let's put a this wide of a road. I can't remember 30-foot road or whatever it was, and then we'll just have 5 foot on each side for ditches, and then whatever 5 feet on each side more for power lines. I just didn't know. So one, I didn't make the easement wide enough to accommodate for really a wide enough road. The road should have been wider, and the ditches should have been wider, and the easement location, which I split on either side, should have just been allocated to one side, really. Like power doesn't run on both sides typically. So I made mistakes on all three of those points.
Could have been avoided with a guy that actually
Yeah.
does it for a living. You wouldn't, your lessons have been learned the hard way.
Mhm.
And maybe that's the point of this whole podcast when everyone sees it, is there's guys out there that know what they're doing. And you yourself, I have seen it or heard about it. You've spent some money figuring things out instead of those things you now know, but there's guys out there that have no idea. And the contractor should be your partner, not, hey, I'm going to come do your job, give me my money. It should be, when I got there, everything was already established on that property, right?
Yep.
And I did mention, hey, this isn't going to work. This isn't going to work. That's not going to work. But we talked about this a little bit ago. You already paid for this to be here, and it should already be functioning. So then it's a real pinch to you where it's like, I got to pay this guy almost as much as I paid the last guy to fix this. right? So do your due diligence on who you're hiring to start off with. And you really need to go into when you go to buy the property and it's big enough and you're going to subdivide it, you really need to look hard. That's the first upfront cost is getting roads in there so utilities can get ran and people can start looking at the lots. Ro- roads in a, well, that's probably the most important thing next to building something there, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they tried that property. When I walked it, I already knew where everything was going. It's abundantly clear. And I was like, well, it's not going there. It's stopping and it's going to blow something out. And it did. It ate away the side of the cul-de-sac. You got to have nice slopes, grades. Those come on the engineering plans that you get from engineers and stuff. You might sometimes have to sit down and think, did I ask them the right questions? I would just Google questions I need to ask a road contractor and take them with me, you
Yeah.
know?
And really like so kind of just on the trajectory we were going. So on the planning phase, all right, we got to make sure the easement's wide enough. We have to account for the road and wide ditches. I mean, like a good ditch is like, I don't know, 20 feet wide. I mean, easily for a 2-car road, 15-foot wide. What would you say?
Right. At the tops, it could be that big. Just depends on how low that land is and how much water needs to move through there.
Right, exactly. So you have to account for a decent amount of ditches, but really what you're looking at is, and this is the engineering and the topographical survey will give you this information, but no matter where you put the road, it will end up becoming a water obstruction. If it's in the lowest point, that water is still going to try to run to a single point, not to 2 points
Yes.
typically.
Yeah, you still need to figure out where you're going to dump it off at.
Right.
Absolutely.
So
You need plans,
water might
everything.
run into either side of the road, and your ditches are going to push it one way or the other. But there may be points where the water ought to cross, and you do not want that to go through your road. You want it to go under your road,
Under
right?
the, yeah.
So that's when you would get call outs. Usually, and the engineer will usually do this, but you'll get a call out for culverts. I mean, there are some good practices around culverts. Maybe you can just spend a couple minutes on culverts. And then, I mean, dang, we're getting close to out of time. So we'll do culverts for a few minutes, and then let's talk about best practices and hiring a contractor. And then I guess we're going to have a part two because there's so much more we still have to cover.
Yeah. Well, you sound like more of an expert on roads than me. You could have a whole podcast yourself on it. Culverts, man, they obviously need to go where you're going to cross over your ditches. Maybe we're all using rural areas as our example for everything I've spoke about. So, you got access to the lot and you have to have some in the rural areas, you're going to have V ditches, you know, so you got to cross over those ditches and not obstruct the water flowing through there. So we use, they have concrete pipes, they have plastic ones, and they have it's galvanized pipes. I have seen where the road and the V ditch aren't kind of working along with each other to get onto the property. And guys will actually dig deeper to set the culvert in, and then basically the water just sits where the culvert's at. So you have your property and your road wherever, and they'll put this culvert way low, thinking I need so much soil above the culvert to make sure that we're not just driving over a bare culvert. So they'll dig it to make it all work level or flat or whatever. I've always you always put the culvert, the bottom of it, along with your V ditch, in the slope that everything's running. And if you have to mound the driveway over it, you have to mound the driveway over. I am telling you, 9 times out of 10, when I go to some places that have roads existing already, the culverts are just and the water just sits there, and the client's like, every time it's eroding, all sorts of trouble where you just from positioning that culvert, right? And I know there's some guys out there that have different methods for a base for the culvert so it doesn't sink. Some guys do, compaction. Other guy, I in rural areas, I just get gravel in there and compact the gravel, and then here comes your culvert, less likely to sink. That's an issue. That's about the only issue with a culvert is placement. too high, too low. You're just going to have the water sit there and it's not doing its job. It's supposed to keep running out.
And size, right? Like
Yes, size matters
there is
on
a
volume.
price. Yes, there is a price difference between the different diameters. So somebody cheap or maybe a contractor that's running out of budget might try to throw undersized ones there, and that's where you're going to run into a whole different
Because
set of problems. And then
the
also,
breeze,
yep,
will back up on a small culvert because you can't pass through the volume of water. It's a statistic that you can find how much rainfall has happened here in so long. Talk to other property owners is what I do. Sometimes I'll stop at somebody's house by there and be like, how bad has it been? How long have you lived here? That determines a lot of stuff without engineering, of
mhm.
course, right? The engineers almost, I always like to say their plans are like law, and there's a reason. Culvert too high or too low, the water's not going to go anywhere. You just wasted money. Too small is going to cause a lot of problems because it back out onto the road, back out onto your property. You know,
Yeah, and then also you fixed one for me that was just oriented incorrectly in the ditch. So the water flow was, instead of coming directly at the culvert and moving through easily, it was kind of coming more at this. I'm sure no one can see, but it's coming more at the side of the culvert and
yes,
kind
it
of
was.
pool. It was pooling on one side of it, and then it would reach a threshold or a level where it would then move through the culvert. But that was
And it
again
was,
causing erosion. So all of these things are meant to not only move water but control the longevity of your road, which is going to be about erosion. So everything has to be able to move through, but also be able to move through with very little resistance. Like, so
as
this,
best as possible.
yeah. So it always seems like somebody will contact me with a project and be like, you just slap a road in there. I'm like, have you ever built a road? And they'll say, no. And I'll say, then there's so many things that you have no idea about. So,
Yeah.
and Tommy, I'm so grateful to be able to work with you. Folks, anyone listening to this in the DFW area, I would highly suggest reaching out to Tommy to do any of your road work. He does road work big and small, whether it's like driveways, dropping culverts, resurfacing things, cutting new roads, knocking over trees, clearing properties. I mean, he pushes dirt, and I have had the honor of working on a few projects with him, but also being able to bring projects preemptively. Like if I have a property I'm considering buying, I want him to take a look at it if I intend to do any sort of dirt work, road work, because he's going to see things that I just don't. I have spent a total of maybe an hour cumulatively in machinery between excavators and, so I just don't have the same vision. And it is extremely valuable to have somebody with the vision to understand the air issues you might encounter, but also just like there's even a disconnect sometimes between the engineer and the contractor, right?
Yeah.
So we
Yes.
had this on our Tennessee project where we had the engineer come to us with plans and we handed them to the road contractor, and the contractor's like, whoa, 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 this is way over engineered. This is way
Yeah.
more than we actually need. And this engineer has just raised the price of your road $700,000. So before we submit this to the county, I think the road contractor and the engineer should talk for a little while to come to,
Always.
yes.
Always. That is a big deal because everything from the houses I've built to the roads to just laying. I've done a tennis court that was they wanted 10 inches of concrete. I didn't understand that. You got to sit down. Your contractor, in an ideal world, your contractor that does something as important as roads probably should have an engineer in his pocket, as I say, to call. And they're gonna always send you plans that are always over engineered. Like I said, I've seen on houses, roads, etc. I call it valued engineering. If you might hurt the engineer's feelings, but at the same time, if it makes sense, why would they say no? You can't do it like that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they want to truck in material that doesn't make sense. There's cheaper stuff that is used by the Department of Transportation that you should be able to use on your property. You know, I just call it valued engineering. It's like, hey, Mr. Engineer, I think that I could use, what do you think about this? Trying to think of an example. I have so many jobs in my head, Logan. It's hard to find an example. But let's say just material wise, it's like, why are we using this really expensive material when we could just use what's on site?
Right.
There's that situation. Will we go right back to you did a soil test? Well, look, what I have here, you didn't factor that in. Can I just use that instead of trucking in 100 trucks of this stuff you're trying to get me to do? Or why are we putting, if we're compacting it, why are we doing so many inches? Now if we're just throwing rock out there and rolling, I can understand, 10 inches of rock, it's eventually going to compress from people driving on it or something like that. But if you're rolling it in, why is he requiring you? Every job's unique, so I just can't come up with an example off the top of my head.
Well, that's
But
great. I mean, we can even talk about it kind of theoretically, right? Like the engineer is going to make call outs for different purposes. Like, yes, all of it is with integrity, but he's kind of also mostly worried about insurance. He's like, somebody could sue me for this road.
Yeah.
Yeah,
He's like
so he's
worried
going to,
about his license, so
yeah, and oftentimes they're operating mostly in theory, right? So you go to most engineers, they probably never run a machine, or they've never actually held the two different types of soils in their hand to really know what they feel like and smell like and all these other things. They also may not be paying attention to, like you were saying, what material is actually nearby the property or what's being
yeah,
sold down the road, or even in some of these rural areas, what equipment is available can be an issue. Like,
yeah,
so all
yeah.
these
So if you,
things have to be tied together between you, your contractor, your engineer,
yeah,
and
this is not a compartmentalized
yes,
program deal with all the building on any kind of subdivision. You really, your team has to work well together. That's why I say guys that do this a lot probably will have a preferred engineer. But then again, that engineer might only be familiar with a certain area. I I I am not an engineer. I don't know how they figure this stuff out. I'm sure nowadays it's computer programs that tell them so much. You know, I have no idea. I've never actually sat down with the engineers I've used before and say, how do you figure that out? Because to me, I've had a natural knack for figuring it out. And then over the years, I've been able to be like, no, that's what you need to do. It's on the client to decide what they want to do, right? Even with engineering plans. So yeah, you have to have a coherent team and always having meetings because we're not talking about a little bit of money. I've never actually done anything significant that's not in the 20, $30,000 range, just to start. So it's very important to look at all those aspects of building just the road. Uh, you know, Nobody actually thinks about the old road we drive, the poor thing.
well, that's a
It-
perfect stopping point. We are at the top of the hour. You and I both have to get to something here shortly. So I just want to say thank you so much for your time, Tommy. There's definitely going to have to be a second episode here. For folks that are in the area and may want to work with you, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
just give me a call. I don't,
Do you have an
put my
email
phone in.
address, maybe?
Yes, I do. It is T. Safford, and Safford is spelled Safford because they always put a T in between the S and the A, but it's Safford 2024 at gmail.com. We're revamping some things, so I had to make a new email for everybody to keep getting a hold of me while we're switching stuff with Microsoft and websites and all this stuff. I'm kind of like rolling real slow. So that's the best way. Email is Safford 2024 at gmail.com. And then my phone number, even though it's going to go all over the internet, is 817-929-7834. And I service North Texas and Southeast Oklahoma. Those are my areas. I can consult on stuff. I have consulted with Logan on projects out of state. And if it's not too extensive and it's just a 10-15 minute phone call and me looking at something, I don't charge a thing. I just love meeting and talking to people about what they're doing with this land.
Awesome. And if folks, you can also just get a hold of me and I'll point you in his direction. But
Mhm.
again, thank you, Tommy. I appreciate it, folks. Thank you for tuning in. If you have not, please subscribe. Please share this episode so that people can learn all about road building, hillbilly road building with us. And we'll see you on the next one. And Tommy, I'm going to have you back on a part 2 very soon. Okay.
Thank you, sir. You have a good morning.
All right. Bye bye.